Now we're working through 24 to 35. The regional director is responsible for motivating the sales staff, devising new sales strategies, and to ensure that all projects come in under budget. So this is an example of a parallelism error, because we have a list of 3 things, and when we have a list of things, they've got to be in the same grammatical form. And we do that mostly because it just helps us figure out what the sentence is trying to say. It's just easier to read and easier to understand. So it's more style than it is pure grammar, though I think there is a certain element of grammar correctness to it as well. So what's the issue? So let's see. The regional director is responsible for motivating the sales staff, devising new sales strategies, and to ensure. So notice it's not the same form as the others, so one way to fix it would be just say, make this ensuring, right? And now they're all in the ing form of the verb, and that's going to make it parallel. Mr. Wilson decided to cancel the final exam and making us do a project instead. So similar to the last one, where it's another parallelism error. In this case, we don't have 3 things in the list. We've got kind of 2 things in the list. This is another example of that compound predicate, right? It's the same subject applied to 2 different actions. So here, Mr. Wilson decided to cancel the final exams and made us do a project instead. That would make it parallel. The new regulations are not only expensive, but also they are ineffective. Another example of parallelism. In this case, whenever we have a word pair, and we'll look at word pairs specifically in a little bit, we need to make sure that the phrases or the things that come after the word pair parts are in a parallel form. So we have the new regulations are not only, there's our first word pair, expensive, adjective, but also, our second part of our word pair, they are ineffective. So notice we have an adjective, and then suddenly we have pretty much a sentence here. So let's just get rid of this, and that will make things parallel, right? Adjective, adjective. The new regulations are not only expensive, but also ineffective. Robin's dream job is to write for the New York Times. He wouldn't mind working for other newspapers, though. So moving more into structure issues again, with the sentence as a whole, coordination issues. This is a comma splice. We've got 2 complete sentences separated with just a comma. That's not good enough. We need to have some other way of connecting it, either comma and a conjunction, a period between the 2 sentences, a semicolon, some other way of combining the sentences together, but just a comma is not good enough. So in this example, I think I suggested adding but, and that's fine. So a conjunction, that's one way. You can also do a semicolon. However you do it, we just got to get rid of the comma splice, the 2 sentences just connected with a comma. The first step is to determine what you want. Then you have to come up with a plan to accomplish these goals. So we have to be careful here because we're used to seeing then completing the thought, but that's with one of those kind of word pairish kind of connectors, if then. This is not an if then. This is just sentence, comma, sentence. So this is another comma splice. And again, there's a lot of ways to fix that. I think in this example, I suggested a semicolon, but again, there's a lot of ways you can change it. Semicolon is fine because it's going to connect the 2 sentences while also keeping them independent. If you don't learn how to think for yourself, you will always be dependent to others for your opinions. So these are the tricky errors of idioms. Remember, idioms are just expressions or ways words go together that have no real rule aside from this is just the way it is, right? There's no rule to memorize. You just have to know the different words that go together. And don't worry too much about this because as a native speaker, if you are a native speaker, you'll know most idioms. If you're not a native speaker, you'll probably maybe have an issue with this, but just be aware they're here. They don't come up too often. What's the issue here? Well, we don't say dependent to others. We say dependent on others. Usually you'll see an idiom with one of these preposition issues. You're using the wrong preposition with a particular adjective or verb or noun or something like that. So that's an idiom error. We'll see another example of an idiom error in 30. The general of the opposing army has a tendency of extending his troops too far beyond their supply lines. So again, we don't say a tendency of, we say a tendency to, right? Why do we say it? Well, I don't know. We just say it because we do, right? It's just the rule. It's idiomatic, as the SAT will often kind of cryptically state in the answer key. This choice is unidiomatic or this choice is idiomatic. Basically just means it's proper grammar for what we say, right? There's no rule to it. It's just the way it is. So they may seem a bit arbitrary to you, but remember, you know most of the idioms already just as a native speaker, and if you're aware they're there, you'll be more likely to pick up on it. 31. When comparing Robert Jordan's books to George R.R. Martin, it's obvious that the 2 authors have different storytelling philosophies. So here we're comparing 2 things, right? So this is a comparison error. But what are we actually comparing? On the one hand, we're comparing Robert Jordan's books, And then we're comparing it to George R. Martin, who is another author, but we have to compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. So we can't compare books to a person. We have to compare books to books or persons to a person. So one way to fix it would be to add George R. Martin's books. That would fix your comparison issue. Sergio's music is better reviewed than Alex's, but I still think Alex's tunes are best. So this is another comparison issue, but it's more with the comparative or superlative forms of verbs. So notice we're comparing music to music, right? Sergio's music to Alex's music, right? That's kind of in parentheses. You can leave it out, though. But I still think Alex's tunes are best. Now, wait a minute. If we're comparing two things, we can't say best. We've got to use better. And the general rule is the comparative, you use better. I should say with the comparative, you use ER as your ending. With superlative, so three or more things, you use EST. So ER with two things, three or more things is EST. The brothers spent their allowance to purchase ingredients being needed for the production of a birthday cake for their mother. So this one's a bit tricky because there's not really anything grammatically wrong with it explicitly. This is more an issue of wordiness. If you have a choice that is said in too many words and clumsily and awkwardly, that could be shortened and made more concise, that's usually going to be enough grounds to make that an incorrect choice or an incorrect grammar usage. So here, the brothers spent their allowance to purchase ingredients being needed for the production. It's a bit awkward. Also, being is a word that you usually will see in wrong answer choices. So what's one way to fix this? Well, if we had to fix it, we could just get rid of all this and just say for a birthday cake for their mother, right? We don't need all this rigmarole, all these words to say something that's relatively simple. How about 34? The legislator couldn't lie himself out of this mess because of the police's evidence, which was strong enough to convict him easily. So again, not necessarily grammatically wrong, but generally the SAT is not really going to like because of. If they use because, they want it to be a complete sentence. So we want to, again, this is wordiness. And one way to fix this would be to use because, but make the sentence that comes after it a complete sentence. So we can get rid of the of and say because the police's evidence, get rid of the comma, was strong enough to convict him easily. So we can kind of reduce their wordiness, make it more direct. The SAT loves using the word because to connect two clauses. So that's what we're generally going to prefer over the original. Even though there was no moonlight, Bigfoot was easily seen by the investigators. Another example of wordiness. This has to do with passive and active voice. And remember, any of these terms that are confusing, go to the SAT Grammar Bootcamp videos or SAT Grammar Tactics videos, because there you'll see basically a deep explanation of all these different concepts. But here, we have the use of the passive voice here, right? Bigfoot was easily seen by the investigators. We'd rather have this flipped around. We'd rather it say, even though there was no moonlight, the investigators easily saw Bigfoot. It's more of a style issue rather than grammar issue, because there's something grammatically wrong with this. It's more direct and active and concise if we flipped around the order of the way that sentence is put together.